Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our Society of Writers, Editors, and Translators March Talk Shop. This is a series of talks of interest to all sorts of people who make up our very heterogeneous society, which is now in its 45th year. And we are delighted to have a chance today to talk to two historians who have undertaken a tremendously ambitious project of translating a history textbook intended for Japanese high school students. This mention of this publication arose on the pre-modern Japanese studies mailing list last year and immediately sparked my interest as a longtime nonfiction translator. And I was delighted when I received an introduction to our two speakers through Professor Bruce Batten and had an opportunity to talk to them about the process of working on this ambitious project. Today, we have an opportunity to ask them questions and learn more about what was involved, which is something of great interest not only to scholars, but translators and editors and publishers. For this discussion, I have asked Frank Walter, manager of all kinds of wordsmithing operations at Export Japan and a faithful Sweat member, to join us and discuss with our speakers. And he will introduce them briefly and then ask them to tell us more about themselves. So with this, I'll hand it over to you, Frank. Onegaishimasu.
Thank you, Lynn. Yeah, my name is Frank Walter. I work at Export Japan, and I'm involved in various translation and editing projects with the Japanese government for heritage sites and other things. Today we have Andrew Kamei. Oh no, I forgot to ask you guys how to pronounce your last name. So we have
We're
Andrew
off
and
to a great start. Kamei-Dyche.
Andrew Kamei-Dyche and Rieko Kamei-Dyche, as you can maybe tell, they are a married couple of two scholars, both who graduated from the University of Southern California and now teach in Japan. So last year's publication of Japanese history for high school is the culmination of a number of years of work of translating and editing and getting into the weeds in how to present Japanese history in English from a Japanese perspective. So if you guys would like to give a little bit of background on your scholarship and maybe how you met, which I assume was maybe at the University of Southern California, but maybe not, that would be great.
Yeah, okay. You want to start?
You can start.
I can start?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, background. So, Andrew Kamei-Dyche. I'm an associate professor of Japanese history at Aoyama Gakuin University. I specialize in the history of books and print culture and reading. And so that's mainly what I focus on.
I'm Rieko Kamei, and I'm also associate professor but not Aoyama Gakuin University, at Wisho University in Japan. And my specialization is basically medieval Japanese history. So especially I'm actually interested in and actually interaction between history and literature. Yeah, that's what I do. But my academic interest seems to have extended quite broadly. So honestly, now I'm not quite sure what my specialization actually is. I guess that is our life as a scholar. So, and regarding how we met, so Frank, so I'm sorry you are wrong. We didn't really actually meet at the University of Southern California. We met for the first time many years before we actually went to USC. I think it was back in 1999, sometime at the beginning of the year. Andrew was a student at Carleton University in Ottawa. And at that time, so I was studying English at the university. And Andrew was a kind of helping kind of Japanese student. and working as a language exchange kind of partner for many Japanese students. But he was not my language exchange partner at the time. He was paired with one of my classmates.
Mhm.
And one day, so I was supposed to go out with a friend who was supposed to be Andrew's language partner. And she was late. Not only 5 or 10 minutes. She was really late. Then, so I was wondering, so what happened to her? And if I remember correctly, she had a meeting with her language partner. And I actually went went all over the place looking for her. And I found her with Andrew. Then, so that's how we actually met.
Can't believe you remember all this.
Yes. Wow.
I have a good memory to shift things.
And then 23 years ago, you guys are doing this book, which is probably unexpected, but quite interesting, quite amazing. So I guess the first question is, how do you come to translate a textbook for high schoolers in Japan? Who asks you to do something like that? Or is it something you applied to do? You saw like a listing. How did that come to be?
A bit of a complicated story, and I think Rieko has put together a couple of slides explaining the story.
Okay, many of you here today probably have read the interview article in the Japan Times we're showing now. And in this article, the CEO of the publisher, Yamakawa Shuppansha, he actually talked about how he got the idea to translate the Japanese history book into English for the first place. And the CEO of the Yamakawa Publishing was a professional rugby player, and he was still working as a rugby player. So some of his foreign teammates asked him if there are any good books in English that explain the Japanese history. And he thought that a very simple question and important question, and that became the inspiration for this project. But we didn't know that. And according to what they had told us, at first, Yamaga thought the process of translating Japanese history textbook was simple and straightforward. And that's what we actually told so many times. So, and in fact, as some of the Yamakawa had previously translated their long-running world history and textbook into English several years earlier. And according to the interview, the project went relatively smoothly. And we were not involved in the earlier world history project, not at all. But from what we understand, it was handled by a professional translation company. And the authors, maybe I should say, the scholars of each chapter of the world history textbook, then review the draft and approve the final version. Right. And the plan was to follow the same process for the Japanese history textbook as well. So if they follow the same process, it had to be mathematically easier. But there's some kind of problem. Now, the publishers actually outsourced to the same translation company again. And then when it comes to, okay, so we need to actually check the final version for publication. Very important question came up. Who is going to check and assess the translation? The scholars, the authors who wrote the Japanese history textbook in Japanese, they are all Japanese historians who worked in Japanese, obviously. They are not very comfortable reading anything in English. Now, then publisher Shimotake asked the scholars if they are willing to do it. But the original author didn't really seem too eager to participate in that process. Then the time comes to get involved. So Yamakawa Shippansha consulted with Professor Kondo, who actually published quite a number of books from Yamakawa. And since I had been actually working with him on the new Cambridge history of Japan, Professor Kondo asked me to help, at least for the chapter covering my area of expertise, which is supposed to be medieval, well, let's say from here to actually up to Muromachi or something. And that's how I became involved in this project in the first place. I then brought Andrew on board. But it's not because he just happened to be my partner. Yeah. As a partner, he's sometimes actually in the painters. So no. I know, yeah. Sorry, I'm a bit too honest. The first reason, it's quite a big book. Quickly actually became actually crazy. It was a little bit too much work for me to handle only by myself, where I have many classes to teach. So yeah, as a side project, it was a little bit too much work. And second, I'm a pre-modernist. I was not very comfortable with being responsible for modern parts. And guess what? Andrew is a modernist. So, and third, although the textbook was written by several scholars, it is still one work and needed a consistent tone and style. For Japanese version, well, there's some kind of gap or how can I say? Some kind of contradiction actually here and there we found, but
sometimes if you go through the Japanese text itself,
and some information kind of overlap.
Yeah.
But at least for Japanese version, so they have editors group who check everything. But for English, Yamaka was not really responsible. That became our job then. So it needed a consistent one style, but the question is who is actually doing everything. And when I actually first saw the first draft the translation company I made, it was read like random collection of completely different things because it was actually translated by so many translators whose skills are also very varied. Then I realized, sorry, it never work as one book, one work. And Andrew is a scholar, but he's an editor. Then, so I wanted his help with that. Also, originally we hired other proofreaders. We would have to work very closely together and have a good knowledge about the Japanese history from ancient to contemporary. And that was another reason. And as I mentioned earlier, it was expected to be a straightforward job. Yeah. Especially the publisher actually believed, oh, that's going to be straightforward. Yeah.
They really underestimated this.
Yeah. And we told them, sorry, the translation is a kind of, some part actually very well translated, but some part, honestly speaking, it gets garbage. So, and it's needed to be completely redone. And it's not really usable as in one work. So the original plan didn't really work out at all. And actually here, our reality being different from the original plan. Originally, our role was supposed to be just reviewing and proofreading the translation done by the translation company. But we had to retranslate the entire text, literally line by line.
It became obvious pretty early on, even when we started taking a look at the first chapter, and it was obvious, oh dear, the translator clearly has no idea what they're actually talking about and what the subject is, and this is just unusable.
And actually, some translators actually went to their own world and tried to actually write something the original textbook didn't cover, and trying to show his or her kind of understanding or theory of some kind of field or subject they care. That's not translation.
Some of them, they had these flights of fancy where they would go off and just start describing lines and lines of their impression of something, but it's not in the text. What is this? Or where is these paragraphs of junk coming from? Just bizarre.
And since it was a big actually book, so we originally actually had planned to divide the work very roughly based on our own specialization. And I will handle the pre-modern section, so maybe up to Edo or something, or early Edo. I can handle the modern part, possibly from mid or late Edo to actually contemporary. But instead, we ended up working on every single page together. And many of you are working as my editor and translator, so you might assume we spread the work based on our native languages, translating, editing accordingly. And that sounds very logical. But in fact, we didn't. And I don't believe it would have worked. Probably this is because our biggest kind of mission was not just shifting the text from one language to another. So it's not just how we translate one historical term into another language. Although actually many people seem to be interested in that point, but it's not what our biggest mission. And our biggest actually mission was actually making sure the historical meaning and the context were very clear without misunderstanding or simplifying, while still, because it's a translation, still staying as close as possible to the original text. And to do that, we both needed to be involved in every section, literally every section. I don't think there's any exceptions. No.
We did, the whole thing. We're basically sitting here now and we have our computers and all of our books around us, and we just went through it gradually, line by line, term by term, step by step, going back and forth. And that was how we pulled it together.
Yeah. We tried to combine our knowledge of both history and language. And so many times we actually discuss only one term or one line for hours and hours, and we still couldn't get a happy solution. And even the following days, okay, so let's go back to the point we have been discussing how we should handle that. That was really hectic. And finally, about the timeline.
Yes,
So,
the timeline.
Yeah. We are originally given less than a year because our original job was actually proofreading. And maybe 7 months or 8 months.
Six or 7 months.
Yeah, little bit more than half a year, but obviously less than 1 year because the publisher hoped to release the book around the time of Tokyo Olympics. But in reality, it took us nearly 5 years to complete at the time. So our house doesn't have any extra space on desk, on floor, everywhere. So then so that's how we able to actually complete our job. So are we answering to your question, Frank?
Oh, yes. I have a lot more questions now based on that. But I guess one question just about this. How did you convince the publisher to let you spend 5 years working on it? A lot of times with the work that I do, and I think the work that many of the people here do who are outside of academia, more of the translation side, the deadline is the deadline almost no matter what the quality is. So why do you think that the publisher was interested in working with you and extending the deadline quite considerably?
Sure. Like Rieko mentioned, it became pretty obvious pretty quickly that we couldn't just do the proofreading, but it was obviously going to have to be completely redone. And so what essentially happened was that we were in discussions with the publisher, and we basically said, this text is not usable. We've tried, we've gone through this, but this is a mess. You can't do this. It has to be retranslated basically from scratch by historians. It's not just a matter of, oh, this is the correct term, this is the wrong term, slot this in, you're done. No, it obviously has to be completely redone. And so the publisher's response was to say, you're historians, right? Maybe you could do it. And so then it was like, and then they said, what? And then we went back and forth with this, how long would it take to do this? And we basically began to give them some estimate of how long it would take us to get a draft ready. And at that point, we could have obviously refused to go any further and say, we don't want to do that. We're not primarily translators, we're primarily historians, although we do a lot of translation work in our own research. And they could have themselves said, we're not going to go any further then because we didn't think it would be such a big project and we don't want to spend that amount of time on it. But they wanted to go ahead and say, how long would it take to do it? And we were naive enough to say, yeah, why don't we go ahead and try then? All right. So that was maybe bloody stupid in hindsight because I didn't think it would take that long. But even then, we didn't think it would take 5 years. We thought maybe we could do it in 2 or something. So I think, yeah, they were pretty eager to get it done, even if it took longer, but much longer than expected. And I think because also we could prove how serious this was. We could send them back the text and say, here are all these problems with this, here's why this doesn't work, and you've got to redo this. So it wasn't just us casually saying this is no good. We could very much clearly back it up. And Kondo-sensei also basically backed us up and said, what Kameis say is legitimate, so if they say this is the case, then that's the case, and you should listen to them. And he has an enormous amount of authority. So when he told the publisher, yeah, you should listen to these guys, that seems to have made a big difference as well.
Interesting.
And if I remember correctly, Yamaka didn't want to make the same mistake as they did actually with the world history book. Because, although the translation process was really smooth for the world history book, so they got criticized for the quality of the translation.
Yes.
And the reason why they consulted Kondo-sensei, and Kondo-sensei asked me to help was they don't really want to be criticized for the quality of translation yet again.
Yeah.
Especially for Japanese history textbook, there's a lot of history fans in Japan who really believe actually they know they're actually obsessed with what they actually kind of care, and we are getting screwed up. Yamaka would be very heavily actually criticized so much, and they are known as a publisher who specialize actually in history, and they are afraid of hurting their reputation too.
Yeah, so although the image in the media was, oh, the world history textbook was successful and it was smooth, so we decided to do the Japanese history one as well, they left out the fact that there was a bit of a backlash to the Sekaishi, which was why they thought it's going to be even worse when we do the Japanese version, so that's maybe why we should consult people and make sure we're not screwing it up.
In that regard, does that mean that they were particularly picky about English word choice? I think it's pretty well known that like Japanese history textbooks have controversies every 5-10 years when some edit gets made. So how did you have an English language minder, or how was the process of having the publisher check what you were producing? And what were the conversations like in terms of how to translate this particular term?
I can't show you everything, but I might be able to show you some screenshots a little bit later on. Basically, we went back and forth with the editorial board, and they would draw up spreadsheets and we would draw up spreadsheets, and they would track every single term and every single translation of every single term. And that itself ended up creating problems because they wanted everything to be I think there's 2 problems going into this. One was that they wanted everything to be perfectly consistent. They wanted every translation to work all the time. And I think we can get into this a little bit later because that doesn't work in history for various reasons, because words change over time and the implications of words change over time, and there's all these other issues. So that was one problem, but they wanted everything done 100% consistently, and that was just not possible. And if you try to translate things 100% consistently all the time from a historical perspective, that creates all kinds of misunderstandings. And the second problem was that they had this view that there's one right translation and everything else is wrong. And so they would keep saying, what's the right one, as opposed to the wrong ones. And even when we began arguing later on that we have to have translation notes to explain things, we saw that as an opportunity to explain our process so that readers could engage with this. And even if they didn't agree, they could see how we'd reached this conclusion and why we had decided to go the route we had. Whereas the publishers saw it as a means of covering themselves by saying, this is why this is right and everyone else is wrong. Which is not the way that I think translation works anyway, and certainly not what we were going for. Yeah, there was a lot of back and forth on this. This is an example of that. This is just one random thing I clipped from one of the spreadsheets, and you can see how here we've got a terminology down the left side, so in this case, Norman and Yakusho. And then we've got these indexes where they track every single instance where they show up in the text, up until that point. And then the various translations that were used for all of those instances. And then we've got the justifications for those. And then this goes on. We've got panels off to the right where we're arguing about why one of these is better than another, or whether this should or should not be consistent. And we've got thousands of these. This long, and it had to go back and forth every time. We had the paper proofs we were trying to constantly correct back and forth, and the digital versions back and forth. So yeah, the terminology they were very sensitive to.
Were you guys responsible for making this document, or was this a document that was made after you submitted a translation copy to the publisher?
They began to put these together as we submitted it in pieces, and they constantly updated it and sent it back to us.
Wow.
So as the process was ongoing, we also had all this back and forth. And then when we'd done the first draft, there was another whole round of this all again from scratch. And then after we'd done the first proof, it was the same thing again with another 1,000 or so entries of all of these, where every single case had to be checked and verified and so forth. So,
how much time did this process take compared to doing the actual translation?
I don't remember.
Too long.
I'm not sure I would have stuck with it. If I had known that's how it was going to be.
We were glad that they took the terminology seriously. I think part of the problem was that the terminology was the only thing that sometimes the editorial board wanted to take seriously. And when it came to other issues like phrasing or the way that things were organized and so forth, then it was a bit harder for us to get them on board.
In terms of making a change from the Japanese, or in terms of even just checking and being like, is this okay?
In cases where, for example, you have a list of things, you have text that runs, well, there is an example ABC. And when you've got A is 99 no and B is 99 no, and you get these complicated structures, sometimes in English it makes more sense to say CBA rather than ABC. And the editorial board would say, no, the Japanese says ABC, so you've got to have ABC too. And we would say that doesn't work in English. It sounds stupid. It's going to confuse people. So you've got to let us do CBA in this case. And even then, subject-object sometimes would have to be changed as well, just because something would make much more sense in English to shift it. And so it wouldn't always match. But of course, inevitably, even now, we get feedback from readers saying, you guys screwed up. The subject is different in the sentence. Or you guys screwed up. This says ABC and you said CPA. Clearly, you don't understand English or Japanese well enough to do this. Okay, so there were issues like that, where, unlike the terminology, it was sometimes harder to convince the publisher to let us go ahead with that.
So in terms of the scope from the publisher, they were wanting a very literal sentence by sentence translation, far more than something that was like easier to read, perhaps, in terms of structure in English.
I mean, we had these discussions with them too, right?
Yeah.
Where on the one hand, we could say, okay, we can do this in a way that's very literal and is very close to the original. And it's going to sound very clunky and probably confusing in English. Or there's the approach where you do it in very natural English. What would English speakers say if they were to say such and such a line? But then, of course, it's going to drift further away from the mechanical structure of the original. And most of the time, we tried to go up the middle. And sometimes that worked and sometimes it didn't work. So that was an ongoing challenge.
I see. Were you working from the teaching copy or just a regular copy of the textbook for the text?
We had both.
Yes.
And we also had supplementary material as well. So we had quite a good amount of material we had to work with.
Was there opportunities to talk with the authors as well about what they were intending with a particular line or something that they were bringing up?
No, if we had issues, we had to go. We obviously know who these people are, and on one or two occasions we've met some of them. But regarding this project, we didn't have that chance. We had to go through the editorial board and say, what's your verdict concerning this? And presumably, in some cases, they would check with the authors and say, this is what the intention of this line is. Sometimes we would say, this isn't clear. Is the author trying to say this, or is he trying to say something else? And they would consult and get back to us and say, it means this is what they're trying to say. We couldn't directly engage with the authors and say, what are you
Original
aiming at?
author was not really being consulted, maybe except on the very few occasions that decision made by their editorial group.
Yeah.
And they're fully aware of the decisions they were making, you think?
At least for Japanese kind of text,
Yeah.
I think they are.
I think, yeah, she's hit the nail on the head there. In terms of what the Japanese text is aiming at and what it was trying to convey, that's true. The editorial board had access to all of the material regarding the composition of the original. And so they had things like the original earlier drafts, which were much longer and more complicated, and therefore they could go back and consult those and find out what the writer was getting at. Things that then over the subsequent year or so with the Japanese prints, they'd revised and cut down and this sort of thing. But of course, we didn't have access to that material. That was something the editorial board had.
I see.
So on the one hand, we were left to our own devices to play around with this and come up with the best we could. And on the other hand, regarding things like the terminology and so forth, there was a lot more oversight than there would be with most translation projects.
That would be a way I would describe it as well. So I guess that is a little confusing because the CEO, right, says that the impetus for it was for his rugby buddies to be able to read about Japanese history, but it doesn't really seem like it would be considered a normal non-Japanese, didn't grow up in Japan, general history of Japan type book. It seems still very sticking in that if only Japanese high schoolers could speak English, they could use this book instead, kind of thing. How did that go? Or like, how did you balance that line of most of the people who are reading the Japanese are not necessarily going to be reading this English book, but it's written for them anyway?
Some of this gets back to the intention of a publisher again. I think originally the publisher didn't know anything about the market in English historiography and just assumed there aren't very many history books about Japan, which is, of course, wrong. There's many in English about Japan. Yeah. Of course, there's a great many history books, and especially there's very little in terms of pre-modern textbooks. If anyone here is a pre-modern, when you're teaching a course in pre-modern Japanese history, you're very limited in terms of the textbooks you've got to work with. If you're teaching a modern survey course in Japanese history, you've got a plethora of different English textbooks, mainly from America, that you can work with. Like how it comes in not really knowing much about this. And they just think it would be nice if English speakers can read about Japanese history in a similar vein to what we do. So that's their sort of approach. And they very quickly become aware that there's another market they could consider, which are people in Japan that are interested in Japanese history but want to read about it in English, want to brush up their English as well. And at the same time, we're also coming in this other angle saying there's another market here, which is students in other countries that want to read about Japan. Because as I said, in terms of comprehensive textbooks that cover all of Japanese history, there isn't that much. And the ones that do exist tend to be very limited in scope, I should say. I don't want to sound like I'm criticizing them too much. And of course, also things like price and that sort of thing as well. So we were saying this could be helpful for undergraduate students in Southeast Asia. This could be helpful for undergraduate students in North America. This is something that you should consider. And the publisher was very wary about that and said, oh, we don't know anything about foreign markets. We don't know anything about that. And we had to push them to get it on Amazon in foreign countries so that people could access this. Because that wasn't something that originally they were really thinking about.
They were really focused on the Japanese market, basically.
Yeah. Which is also why when we were doing it, we wanted to do it in a way that was accessible, but also still fairly academic. We didn't want this to read like it was written for children, basically. We wanted this to read, this is for introductory history students who have a little bit of grounding and so forth. It should be able to function as a high school / undergraduate text, which is also why we didn't like the title. We really wanted them to just call it something like Japanese history or a survey of Japanese history,
introduction,
rather than this Japanese history for a high school thing that they were hung up on. But we lost that fight. So that's it, which turned out to be an issue because, of course, people in the US have told us, I want to use this in my class, but my students aren't going to read something that's called for high school because they feel like it's patronizing them. Oh, you're children, you can't keep up or something like this. So they're going to feel insulted and not want to read it. Which is frustrating.
Yeah, that's interesting. Because it doesn't read like a high school textbook per se. It has, this is shifting to a little bit more about the content, but it does seem to have sometimes a little bit of an angle, which I know from just being in now, like learning about Japanese history, that Japanese history tends to be a little more progressive, a little more maybe Marxy. How much of that was in the original Japanese? Did you tone that down or did you turn that up?
Oh boy. There might be a bit of an interesting cultural gap here within Japanese society in that mainstream thinking about history and culture tends to be a little bit more conservative. Whereas on the other hand, if you look at media or academia, much more progressive type of angle, it's a bit of a gap there. And Japanese historiography going back to the 50s was enormously influenced by Marxism. So especially the authors of the text, they're older guys, they echo back to the 60s and the 70s when Marxism was still very strong. And so the text does have some elements of that. They're talking about the shoguns and they're using terms like, oh, the shogun was an autocrat, because of course they're like, it's all about exploiting the peasantry and this sort of thing.
They spent so many pages on fertilizer.
Oh, the fertilizer. Yeah, it's because, of course, you got to get the farmers in there, which is great. That's an important part of history. But at least one of them was inordinately interested in fertilizer. And there's quite a few points where the text goes into great detail about the composition of fertilizer in different time periods. And that's even more obvious in the Japanese text because it was considered very important. And that was a real reflection of the angle of the authors who were writing that. On the one hand, we wanted to convey accurately what the text was saying, but also if they want to say such and such a person was politically powerful and influential, or that they had very strict regulations, you can do that in a more meaningful way than saying they're an autocrat. So on times like that, we softened it a little bit to say we don't want people to get the wrong idea about this because the writers are obviously coming at this with their particular slant and maybe it's a little bit overdone.
Was there concern from the editorial board about if and how the English edition would be picked up in the foreign press?
Don't think so.
I think that's really been an issue.
Yeah.
I mean, there's, again, this kind of funny thing here where the impression that I get from when I talk to people in the media and the impression I get sometimes from foreign students that don't have any background in the field, they'll repeat this line, oh, Japanese textbooks are all biased and they're all extremely nationalistic and they never even mention the Second World War and all this stuff, which is immediately tells me these people have never even read a Japanese history textbook. Because if anything, they tend to be rather bland compared to the textbooks that I see in North America. When I was in high school and I studied American history, our American history textbook was a great heritage, and it was going on about how amazing American culture and so forth was. You would never get that past an editorial board for a Japanese history textbook. They would shut that down and say, this is just propaganda. We can't put that out. So to have students in the media say Japanese history textbooks are all nationalistic propaganda, and I think, really? Where are you getting this from? Because it's... So that was odd. In fact, strangely enough, one of the first things that happened when we did this was that I had some colleagues contact me and say, this is really helpful because we study the history of education, and finally we can put to rest this myth that Japanese history textbooks are all nationalistic propaganda but never talk about the Second World War, because we've got this translated example we can show to people in the media and our students and say this is what mainstream textbooks in Japan are really like, and they're not like that.
Yeah, rather more
Slightly on the other side.
Other side.
Interesting. Yeah.
It's an interesting issue, even though it wasn't really something the publisher was particularly into it.
Thinking about or trying to change or anything like that. Yeah. You mentioned that there's already been feedback from what I assume Japanese people who are either scholars or just very interested in Japanese history and kind of being like, what about this thing? What about this thing? What about this thing? Has there been much comments, criticism, or praise from non-Japanese readers that you have received so far, or?
Yeah, we've had quite a few positive responses. We've had positive responses from professors in the US that want to use it in their classes, which was great. And
Christopher Mayer.
Yeah, and one of the things I've also seen brought up is especially its use among people in smaller schools, small liberal arts colleges and this sort of thing. And the two things that they highlight were, one, that it's very comprehensive. It's got a lot of pictures, a lot of examples, a lot of good coverage, and also a price, which was something that, again, we'd pointed out earlier. If you want to teach an introductory course in Japanese history and you want to use power or something, I don't know what the price is, but it's got to be $100 and something, $150 or so forth, which is a lot of money for a student in the US. Whereas this textbook comes in and it's much cheaper. And so that was something that smaller schools and so forth seem to have responded to very positively. It's great. It's got all this coverage and it's cheap. Students can afford this. So I don't know if it's been picked up in terms of the Western media and so forth very much. No, don't think so.
Because Yamaka is not really action marketing outside Japan.
Yeah, it's a marketing thing. And Yamakawa are not alone in this. Publishers are shirking on the marketing angle these days. My last monograph, I'm not going to mention the publisher, but you can look this up if you want to, but there was zero marketing. They basically said, oh, mention it on Facebook, mention it on Twitter. That's great. That'll do it. But we're not going to send copies to journals anymore. We're not going to contact the media anymore. We don't do that. Just mention it on social. That's good enough. And I was just shocked. And all the time, I meet people in my field who say, you wrote a book about this? And I say, yeah, but the press didn't advertise it, which is why you don't know. So Yamakawa is not unique in this regard. To their credit, they did give a push in Japan, which we appreciate. But they didn't really make any attempt to go outside of that.
Yeah, they sent a couple of copy to Japan foundations overseas, but that's pretty much it.
Yeah, I think that's it, basically.
Yeah.
I see. Okay. So it's not super well known necessarily outside of Japan yet. Huh. That's interesting. I wonder if it will be. It would have been, in my own undergraduate studies, it would have been nice to have this book, let alone a class that was this comprehensive, but that was a long time ago.
There's one more question we'd like to ask about, which is, we've heard the rumor that you are working on the revised edition of the book, and maybe that would be something for people like us to know about in advance, and obviously more issues to come up with that.
So, what's going on with the revised edition?
We just sent support to the final draft to the publisher a few days ago. And the revised version is supposed to be bilingual version. Yeah.
Oh.
It's going to be big.
It's going to be really big with slightly bigger font.
Yeah, one of the responses we got from people is the font's too small, which I understand. But yeah, some people gave us 1-star reviews on Amazon and said this sucks because the font's too small. So the publisher paid attention to that, and they said, let's try to make the font bigger in the revised edition.
So the idea is not just to raise the font and make it bilingual, but also to make some corrections or revisions or that kind of thing.
Got 550 revisions. I'm very glad that when we went through it again and we had responses from the editorial board, we had many responses from this and so forth, there were very few actual errors.
Yeah.
There were errors. I will be the first to admit there were mistakes, but thankfully not very many. What we hadn't anticipated, there were quite a few cases where people said, you're wrong because this is mistaken or something. And we weren't wrong, but we realized going back through the text that the way we had phrased something had given some people the wrong impression. And that perhaps we could be a little bit more concrete here. Perhaps we could tie this down a little bit more to avoid that misinterpretation. So there are quite a few cases where that happened. And then there were just various things like typos and that sort of thing. So there were a lot of little revisions that have been made.
If possible, could you share like a specific example of one of those, making it a little more concrete or tightening it down a little bit to avoid confusion?
There are cases where, for example, we had Japanese chestnuts and acorns, and readers pointed out to us you could misread that line as saying Japanese chestnuts and Japanese acorns. So maybe you should say Japanese chestnuts, comma, and acorns. And I thought, yep, that's great use of the Oxford comma there. So sometimes in lists like that, we added commas in there to make things clearer. There is a couple of examples I'm going to put up here. So this is from page 62, and it's describing a process of making a type of art. And you can see at the top, the first edition said this type of statue was made by having a prototype, which was subsequently removed, covered with layers of lacquered hemp cloth. And a lot of readers found that really confusing. They weren't sure at what stage in the process the hemp cloth was being taken off and how it was involved. So we rewrote that to say, made by covering a prototype with layers of lacquered hemp cloth and later removing the prototype. And I'm sure my fellow editors will say, that sounds a lot clunkier, Andrew. Yes, it does sound a little bit more clunky, but it avoids confusion.
It is much more accurate.
So, and on the right, we've got a case here where the footnote on page 162 was describing Magellan. Yeah. And the original note, the subject, of course, is not 100% clear in the original note. And we said Magellan explores the Philippines, and then he continued on to go around the world. And of course, we realized after having done that, actually Magellan dies en route and doesn't himself complete the expedition. So in the revised version, we changed the subject in the sentence. So it says, he goes to the Philippines, but then his fleet continued around the world. But this is a case where the subject in Japanese ended up causing us a little bit of trouble. So that was something that we corrected. So there's a lot of cases like that.
Gotcha. So it's a lot of little things. It's not rewriting a whole paragraph or...
No.
Oh, that's great then. That's what you like to hear?
Yeah, there's definitely nothing in terms of major. Oh, there was one thing that came up. I learned something by doing this, and that's that meters squared and square meters are not the same thing. And in the original version, we were describing a piece of land and saying meters squared, and what we actually meant was square meters, as in a square that has sides of that X number of meters. And the problem is that this issue actually exists both in Japanese and in English. It's possible to misread that as saying that's the area rather than the side of the rectangle in question.
Yeah.
And so to avoid that misunderstanding, we edited that in the revised version to say a square of dimensions x times 1 rather than just saying meters squared, because it could be drastically possible to misunderstand what that was getting at.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I've made that mistake in a sign before, in fact. Gretchen asks about the translation notes.
Translation.
If you guys want to, because my understanding is you had to fight for the translation notes, but because there are translation notes in the English copy now.
Yes.
50 of them, I think.
47 or 49.
47, 49. Okay.
Yeah.
Gretchen, do you want to ask a specific question about the translation notes, or you just wanted to confirm that they existed?
No, in a book like this, I was just wondering whether translators' notes would be included or not to begin with. And if you did manage to get translators' notes included, then what was it that you covered were they like footnotes to the certain issues or general notes to begin with type of thing?
Early on, we pointed out to them that there are various cases where we wanted to explain the reasoning behind certain translation choices. And we were able to get permission to do a preface. So we wrote our preface, and our preface included some examples of translation issues.
And our updating the policy.
Yeah, and what our translation policy was. So we talked about things like samurai, for example, and how people who don't know much about Japanese history tend to use the term samurai in the wrong way, and how the term bushi evolved over time. It means different things in the Middle Ages than it means in the Edo period. And so that's an example of something people have to be aware of when they're translating. We also gave examples where things in English use very different terms than things in Japanese. For example, Seinen Senso, the war where Saigo Takamori rebels against the Japanese government, in English is called the Satsuma Rebellion. So we use that as an example. But even though we did the preface, we still told the publisher, we need more than that. We need to actually have translation notes where we talk about certain things. And they gave us permission to do that. So in most of the cases, what we do in the translation notes is we're talking about specific terms and what the issues are with those terms. And either we focus on the reasoning for choosing a certain English term, or we talk about issues around the Japanese term, sometimes at once.
Or English terms.
So if you look at this example here, for example, this is about Naidaijin. And this is one of those particular issues where Naidaijin, I say, is a term used for two very different positions. So this again gets back to historical context again.
Yeah.
In the 1860s, so 1867, 1868, when you had the Meiji Restoration, and then you had this shift where they're trying to come up with a new type of government. And although the Meiji government is a very modern experiment, the Meiji oligarchy had this kind of policy where they're trying to make it look as if it's a return to ancient government. And therefore, what they're doing is they're dressing up very modern positions, very modern institutions with ancient terminology. So they take all these titles and references from the ritual system back in ancient times, and they stick it on top of these modern things. This is a person who their role in the classical Japanese court is more like an internal manager, and we often call them an inner minister. Whereas their position in the Meiji period is basically the government's liaison with the royal family. And it's usually translated as Lord Keeper of the Privy Seal. So it's a very different position that in Japanese has the same title because the modern government was trying to echo the pre-modern one. But we can't translate it the same way because these two things are very different, even if in Japanese they had the same characters. So that's an example of what we did in the translation notes.
Thank you very much.
I appreciate you explaining this process, which sounds like it was a tremendous headache in many ways for a long time. And as a translator myself, I really have to empathize. And actually, this Naidaijin example is a great segue into my question. I have a few, but I'll start with one. You talked about the editorial board had this desire to apply a strict one-to-one relationship between Japanese terms and their corresponding English translations, which is something I think is not uncommon coming from people who don't understand translation well. But given that this textbook had the ostensible secondary purpose of being a tool for Japanese students as well, possibly with their language acquisition, was that an explicit reason for this, that they were saying we want students to know A equals B in all cases, or was that not really being considered?
I think here again is a case where the editorial board was not really clear with who they were marketing this towards. And early on, for example, they had this idea that sort of everything should be translated, as in the sense that you shouldn't use Japanese terms. And this is not a unique sentiment. Years ago, I was doing a column for a newspaper with a colleague of mine, and the editor at the newspaper would always get angry when we would use Japanese terms in the English version. he would say, don't say kimono, you have to say traditional Japanese silk document, silk outfit, or something like this. And he would get really angry. He'd say, that's not English if we used any kind of Japanese word. And so the publisher this time around also tended to say you shouldn't use Japanese words. And so we had this pushback process where we said, we want to use Japanese words where it's important because you can't really do Japanese history without knowing key terms. It's helpful to Japanese speakers to know what we're talking about. And it's also helpful for the foreign learners to understand some of these key terms. So there was this gradual pushback where we were able to convince them, let us romanize key terms, let us have Japanese text, let us have the Ruby underneath things that show what this term corresponds to in our usage so that people can understand. Yeah. So as much as possible, we wanted this to be a helpful reference for people, especially in cases where, again, there's a shift. So if I can share another example here, yakusho is another one. This is another one of those terms. It's often rendered as farmers or peasants, and of course, very different connotations, right? When you say the farmers versus the peasantry, very different connotations. But of course, it's used in ancient times to mean one thing. It's used in early modern times to mean a social class. It's used in modern Japanese to mean farming communities. If I have a Japanese student who says, oh, my family is hyakusho, she doesn't mean my family are the peasant class. She means they're farmers, they're agriculturalists. So these are all these issues where we wanted to say what's going on here. This is so that people were aware of these types of issues and could make their own judgments rather than us just saying, this is the correspondence, this is what you've got to do. So yeah, this again is something that I think the publisher was not really taking into consideration at the start. And I'm glad we were able to get that in there. Not quite sure if that answered your question, but
I think you did. It sounds like any kind of push for additional explanation and contextualization came from you, if anything, and was not really on the mind of the editorial board. So when it comes to these extensive glossaries, which thankfully it sounds like you did not have to create yourselves, my first thought when considering trying to do a project this size was, do I get to use a cat tool? Am I allowed? Is this all manual? Is it spreadsheets? Or do I get to help myself out a little bit? And I was curious what the ruling was on that when you first took the project and why, if there was a rationale.
This was non-tool assisted, 100% old school manual hardcore labor. And that's not because I'm a sort of purist. It's not because we're purists that think that's the only way to do it. It's because so much of this started out ad hoc. And as it turned into a full-scale project, we thought we're going to need to use this to track this, we're going to need to use this to track this. But it was all still done manually. There was no particular rule where they said you can't do that, but yeah, we tended to do it in a very manual form. I suppose we are purists to some extent. When I've got students that organize their essays using automatic programs and automatic citation and so forth, and it screws up because inevitably stuff screws up. When I say, that's your fault for not doing it manually, then that wouldn't have happened. So that's me being an old-fashioned sort of person. So no, we didn't have tools for this. It was all done manually.
Yeah, manually. Yeah.
Data entry stuff. Which is crazy, again, when you think about it, right? If you'd asked me now, would I want to spend 5 years doing that? I would have said no, but...
Yeah, all I can really say to that is oof. So often with translation work, we find ourselves faced with really intricate, interesting, tough challenges that no one ever hears about because they're completely invisible in the finished product. And I always wish someone would ask me, like, you know, what was really hard about this that you put a ton of work into, but it's not evident? So this is my opportunity for you. It's an invitation. If there's a particular sentence or a passage that stands out as, oh, we spent 2 days on that, no one will ever know, please tell us about it now.
Thanks. That's a great question. I'm not sure if...
Yeah,
there's random things I can come up with that are in response to certain issues.
but there are so many kind of parts we really struggle when we are working on them, but yeah, I don't really remember.
I'll give you a
right?
couple of things. This here is chapter 3.
Oh, yeah.
And you'll notice probably two things right off. First is that why didn't we call it national? And second, why do we have different readings of Seiji? And this is an example of things that we spent an enormous length of time thinking about. So the reason why the subheading there for Second Seiji, the politics of the regency, we called that regental politics because that section is using Seiji in a very mechanical way. It's all about the structure of the government, how the administration functions, and so politics was a good way of rendering that. But in the title of the chapter, it's using, although it's still Seiji, it's using it in a very broad way to mean the whole system of rule, basically, not just the mechanics of the politics itself, but the whole kind of system. And so in that case, calling it politics would not be great, and we thought that to call it rule would be much more accurate in that context. And the second thing here with the kokoku, of course, is that if you're an historian, you're very sensitive to terms like national and nationalism, which are products of Enlightenment thinking, European consciousness in the 18th and 19th centuries. And so you get this problem when you look at like Japanese history, and people are very quick to throw out nation state, nationalism, and so forth, even if they're talking about ancient times, because of course modern Japanese history itself is also a product of encounters with German historiography in the 19th century, and it's got the same kind of assumptions underlying it. But it doesn't really make any sense to talk about like national consciousness in the 8th century or national culture. It's just illogical. But of course, Japanese speakers, when they see like Kokuhu Bunka, are not thinking modern nation-state ideology. They're just thinking the local Japanese culture in contrast to the culture from overseas, primarily from China. So we were thinking, how can we convey that? And after a lot of thought and deliberation, we came up with this, we'll call it native Japanese culture. We don't want to use indigenous because that sounds like we're talking about the Ainu or something, which again is not appropriate here. We can't just say Japanese culture because that's way too vague. It's something, so we had this native Japanese culture. So that's an example of something that people probably didn't think about very much, or readers might take a look at this at a glance and say, you idiots, obviously it's national, and not really think about why we spent hours and hours debating about the way to deal with that.
It's autochthonous culture, you fool.
Yes. Another thing is cases where it might become obvious that we've used different romanization for things. This is the chart from chapter 2, when we're talking about the Ritsurol system. We've got Daijokan over there on the upper left, the Council of State. And remember that I said that in the Meiji period, the Japanese government, when it's building the modern system, they're echoing this ancient system to make it look as if they're recreating it. So what happens is when you get the modern Meiji government, they also call parts of it after these ancient institutions, although they're very different. So here we have from chapter 9, page 284, and you'll notice we've got Dajokan, Council of State. So of course, same Japanese term, but why? What's going on there? I don't know how Heian people actually read this, but pre-modernists very much prefer to use Daijokan rather than Dajokan when they talk about this institution. And if we had used Dajokan for pre-modern times, people would have said that's not accurate. Pretty much everybody prefers Daijokan. But on the other hand, in the 19th century, we know that literally this was read Dajokan by the government, and they were writing it on things and everything. So this was the standard reading. So we've got the same term, and we're rendering it one way for pre-modern and another way for modern, and it's not a typo. This was a very conscious decision because of how that functioned and what the consensus is regarding that term within its own context.
Yeah, most of our story actually comes from the particular term of the language, both in Japanese and English, use what kind of connotation it has in which time period, in what context. That's what we have to take everything into consideration. That causes us quite a big headache.
That's really fascinating. Thank you.
this kind of discussion really takes me back to lots of translations about Japanese history from Japanese to English over my own career, and how I was taught by Japanese collaborators and senior editors to be very careful with choice of words like country, nationality, and to distinguish. If you're translating about pre-modern Japan, use one word if it's modern Japan. So this is very much part of my editorial stance, is to be particular about terms like that.
Yeah.
Because especially people who haven't studied Japanese history per se, or who are just writing in a very loose sense with words, tend to be a little bit careless, or maybe they just don't realize how important it is to make the distinctions in the use of words, and also to be alert to that kind of differences between daijokan and dajokan, as you mentioned. That's such a good example, which those of us who've been around for a long time, all of that knowledge accrues, but it takes years to know what is correct for what era and how to be sensitive to those differences, especially from the point of view of Japan, when we're translating in Japan for transmission to other countries, which I think is quite different from when you're producing scholarship or translating from the other side, from outside. And so your position as working on this project from Japan, I think, is extremely significant. And the fact that you put in so much work is not at all surprising to me. I've been through many projects of a similar nature, and it's really inescapable. One problem at a time has to be solved. And there are so many complex ones which originate both in the Japanese and in the English. So that's one reason that I really celebrate what you've been trying to do, even though it might not be 100% satisfactory to yourselves. As nonfiction translation is an excellent display of what can be done if given the chance to do it.
Thank you. It's like Rieko said, we're cognizant of context, I think, which is just something that comes with the territory.
Yeah.
I was on a related note, it's like what you were saying, how we have to just learn these things over time. And of course, there are so many contexts that people need to be aware of. I wrote an article once where I remember I was talking about relations between England and Japan in the 16th century. And the editor I was working with crossed that out and said, no, you should say United Kingdom. And I thought, in the 16th century? I don't think so. But they weren't even aware of that. From their perspective, looking at it now, United Kingdom is the proper term. You shouldn't say England. But of course, that's another context. So it hadn't crossed their mind. They were a Japanologist. And so there's so many cases where there's all these different, it's not just even one context you've got to be aware of, it's multiple contexts.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, one other thing I might mention, there's also cases where we couldn't use the same translation, not because of a technical reason per se, but because of things like repetition.
Yeah.
I'll just give you one little example here if I can share this. So this is from page 8 of the original. And you'll notice there, it doesn't sound overly repetitive in Japanese. We've got this line that the Koshitude that starts out by saying, well, there's these kind of village plays that are put on by villagers, and it's an important type of entertainment for villagers. And so you've got this villagers do village plays, which are important for villages, and it ended up sounding really awful in English. And so we had to shift that around a little bit, and we said murashibai, village plays, mainly by young people in rural communities, became an important source of entertainment for villages. So we only got villages in there twice rather than saying villagers do village plays for villages. Yes. Cases like that where we just wanted to avoid repetition.
Excellent. Yeah, that's the kind of thing we have to do when we're writing or translating or editing about Japan, is to use those various ways that English can express things. And you mentioned the behest to make everything consistent. And I find this is a kind of obsession with clients who don't know English very well, that having something translated exactly the same way is a form of security, but it does take explanation to help them understand that it doesn't have to be exactly the same for every single instance. It takes a lot of patience to deal with that misnomer. So do we have any other questions from other people? Please don't hesitate to.
I have a question. What's the forecast for the revised edition as far as time? And are you just going to tackle just those 500 or so odd small things, or will there be any reshaping of the entity in any major way?
As the 550 revisions and so forth are done, what we're trying to sort out now is what to do with the translation notes and whether we should expand them into a different format or not. And that discussion is ongoing. So that's going to factor into the time frame for that.
Thank
So
you.
we were
Hopefully it
hoping-
won't take 5 years.
No, it shouldn't take 5 years. They were hoping for later this year, but
No, even after summer, yeah, by September or October. But if they want us to rewrite translators' note for kind of their new audience, it takes more than a couple of months. So the schedule they're suggesting now is not very realistic, honestly. So we are still discussing the issue with the publisher.
Thank you.
So is there anyone from the pre-modern Japanese studies mailing list here who would like to indicate any questions that might have come from that direction? I'm curious to know if there were. So one of the things that might come up there is about this kind of publication, which is not necessarily intended for the Japanese studies market as it exists. What sorts of issues does it contain for professors or students in that market? Do you think it's perfectly fine the way it is, and it offers new facets of Japanese history that might not be available in existing English textbooks?
Okay. Yeah, like one thing I mentioned earlier is the fact that it's fairly comprehensive. There are textbooks in English that cover all of Japanese history, but there aren't very many of them, and they're either very expensive or they have a particular slant. I tried teaching with Topman's text, for example, and Topman's text, The History of Japan by Blackwell, that's a very big text, and Topman has a very environmentalist angle. And so he doesn't talk about the modern era, he talks about the era of the consumed dead or something. But he's talking about fossil fuels, burning the dead. And yeah, some of you, I'm sure, are rolling your eyes. So it's got that slant. And when I tried to use that with my students, some of them said, this is really weird. This is not helping us understand. And of course, some of them they reflect the context for what they're aimed at. If you're going to write a textbook for American undergrads, it's going to contain certain things that wouldn't if you were writing for something else. When I was an undergraduate student, I remember reading one of our Japanese history textbooks that had a preface saying something like, the Japanese are not like us. Their thinking is different, or something. And I thought, what? It's based on these kinds of assumptions. So as an alternative to that, I think it's quite helpful. I mean, I myself, as a professor, I wouldn't teach only with something like this. Basically, you use this type of textbook as a frame to give the students, the basic kind of things. It's designed as a reference. This is somewhere that they can look up the key ideas, the key institutions, the key individuals, these type of things. And then you plug into that as a professor. You plug into that primary sources, personal accounts, explanations of things, controversies, all this sort of thing. Yeah, the textbook can't take the place of those. It's just a frame.
One of the big values of this textbook is that it provides that kind of background for not just scholars and students, but writers and editors and translators who suddenly need to do a quick study of, for example, Kofun period and the Japanese state, the Yamato state, or whatever is going on. And so having, and already the Encyclopedia of Japan, which has not been updated, is of limited use because so much research has been done. But these textbooks, of course, are updated all the time. So they do reflect more recent research and findings. And so we can stay on top of things. And I think this is so important, especially in this era of tourism, when so much of the work we wordsmiths are doing is related to very broad Japanese culture and history, written in such broad strokes that it's almost impossible to translate. It's like the Japanese reader knows immediately from a few words about the Edo period or Bushi or whatever, but we need to know more in detail so that we can translate correctly or edit correctly. And so I think the usefulness of a book like this for those of us who are involved in Hashin type transmission from Japan work is just very valuable, and hopefully will be turned to by more of us in the years to come.
One more thing I want to add is, aside from this kind of history textbook translation, is very informative, comprehensive. There's one thing very unique about Yamaka's history textbook. As some of you may aware, Yamaka's history textbook has been enjoying market share of probably more than 60% or over 60%, maybe a bit more, nearly
Probably
70%, which means so many or more than half the Japanese population has studied Japanese history by using Yamaka's textbook. So I myself also has used their textbook when I was a high school student, which means if someone wants to know how in the majority of Japanese studies Japanese history, from what angle, what kind of topic, this textbook can be kind of useful to compare even how kind of Japanese education has been developing in terms of the kind of historical field. So that's something actually only Yamakawa can, do. So, and yeah, as Andrew mentioned several times, we are not quite sure who's gonna be our targeted audience. From the beginning through actually until then, and even now, we are not really quite sure 100% or so who are we supposed to be really targeting. So Yamaka has their kind of, targeted audience, and we also have our targeted audience, and we try to actually kind of compromise. We are not really quite sure about actually our targeting audience, but actually it turned out the majority of the people who purchase this textbook are those who studies Japanese history with Yamaka's book. And they want to remember want to compare to what they had studied when they're a high school student, and how the textbook they are familiar with being translated into English. Then we wanted, and Yamaka also wanted, more Japanese historian working in English sphere pick up our textbook. Unfortunately, it doesn't really seem to be very successful, but among people who used to be fond of Yamaka's textbook, our translated actually book, when it came out. And maybe some of you might want to know how much the book actually has been sold right now.
Oh,
because
the first print run sold out really fast.
So, yeah. I'm not quite sure what is the standard of the first print run. Actually, what is the first run? According to the contract actually we had nearly 1 year ago, that was 13,000.
Whoa!
That's pretty big.
And they were all
sold pretty quickly.
And
Sugoi.
next one. And when do you think the decision was made for the second printing? After they had 13,000 of actually in the first run. And
Right,
it has been only 1 year since it's first came out. It only
Yeah.
came months later. So we don't know exactly because it's not really our decision, that publisher's decision, and we don't have any kind of concrete data. But according to actually what they have told us, so they had decided to go to the second printing in 2 months.
Yeah.
It sold pretty quickly.
You were that these were being sold mainly in Japan. I mean, that Yamaka
Yes.
didn't have distribution.
Mainly in Japan.
We've got the
Wow.
ranking things here.
There, it was ranked 53 on Amazon.co.jp.
Oh,
And about 10 days later, so on the site, we show the kind of data, but that is on online, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, it ranked 1 in Japanese history section. And not only among the general audience, it was sold pretty well among the university students as well. Next slide. Yeah, data so collected by a bookstore at University of Tokyo. And among actually, among actually kind of their kind of humanity book section, the textbook was ranked number 7. So it's pretty highly reviewed and it worked really well sold. Yeah.
We tied with Iwami Koza.
But that might be the reason why Yamaka want to have the revised version. Yeah.
What was the most fun about the project?
I learned a lot.
Yeah.
Yeah. Many things was really frustrating, but at the same time, so we learned quite a lot. And yeah, that was really intellectually stimulating experience for both of us. So that was the most enjoyable part. Yeah. Although we argue all the time.
Oh, we argue a lot.
And for almost 5 years, we couldn't really clean up our rooms. So
Yeah.
we are living with a lot of paper and dust. But it was a kind of interesting experience.
Yeah, it was part of the reason I became an historian is because I love Japanese history. So being able to learn or to go back through so many things and to investigate some areas that I hadn't studied particularly much, like fertilizer, this sort of thing, right? Farming practices and so forth. Various things that were normally outside some of our purview was interesting. So it was an excuse to do a lot of research on various topics and so forth, which was very enjoyable. I don't think when we started this, we expected to learn very much, but we came out from this having a lot of good discussions and learning a lot of different things. So that was enjoyable for me.
and there's so much graphic material in the volume with the maps and the charts and the diagrams and the pictures of different kinds of attire, or I'm looking at a coin. There's so much very concrete information about little facets of Japanese history and culture that you had to grapple with, and everything is got an English equivalent and can be used as a reference for those of us who may or may not encounter such minutia in our work, but we do encounter it. And there are lots of resources for finding glosses for such things in English, but they are not together. So I think this book is a good place to go. And you've obviously done your homework in looking up the kinds of terms that are used, and also in using Japanese terms to their full extent, which is something that we also have to do in translation and editing. Very useful as something for us to use as a reference.
Thank you. We're very happy that it's helpful to anyone.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Hello. I would just like to recommend another book by
Andrew.
about reading. It's another great book by Andrew, which we have in our Japan library in New Zealand.
Thank you so much.
I highly recommend that for anybody. And thank you for a wonderful talk today and all your great work.
Thank you so much.
Yes, wonderful. Thank you, Jillian. stalwart sweat member.
Thank you, Rieko and Andrew. I think it was very interesting. Thank you for sticking with us for the whole 2 hours and being patient with all of our various questions on the minutiae of translating such a large and intensive document, made even more so intensive by what appears to be the horrible hell of Excel sheets documenting the use of nearly every single word. Thank you guys so much. It was very insightful and enlightening.